today with Dr. Jane Bluestein. Thank you so much for joining us. We are looking forward to talking with you also in class today. Would you introduce yourself a little bit and talk a little bit about your teaching journey and where you are now in relation to the classroom and what you do?
Yeah, I've kind of gone through like a whole lot of different iterations as an educator. Started out in the classroom in the early 70s, worked inner city Pittsburgh, and I mean, since I was about 3, 4 years old, all I ever wanted to be was a teacher. And guess what? That wasn't enough. I thought, my passion for this, my excitement about it, I ended up doing very well in my teacher prep classes. I could construct lessons. I had beautiful bulletin boards. I had wonderful lesson plans, and everything was great. And then I walked into a class of 39 fifth graders starting. I've worked with all ages, but I started out with a self-contained fifth grade class. And most of these kids had had really bad experiences in school, had had high rates of failure. And one of the first kids that I met, came up to me and it's like, I don't do reading. And I'm thinking, oh, what page is that on? Nobody taught me about how to deal with kids like this, with the attitudes and the arms crossed, across their chest, like, I dare you to teach me something. And I had that up through middle school and later with older kids. They were just so defensive that, there wasn't really any point in trying to bond. So my biggest hurdle for me was connecting with these kids in a way that created enough trust and safety for them to be able to start where they were, take risks, and make some progress. And I had a lot of walls to break down. And I really thought that just being good and being passionate would be enough. And that was very disappointing,
Yeah.
even today.
I
Yeah.
can see that. We've spent the last couple weeks talking about constructing classroom community and how we can create safe space. Do you have
Yeah.
any advice about how to do that? How to start breaking down walls, how to be proactive in creating a classroom community before you even meet your student or once you meet them and see kind of where they're at?
Yeah, it happens in the process. I don't know that you can do it really beforehand unless you have a lot of communication beforehand, which of course we didn't have access to things like emails and websites and things like that. We did make home visits back in the 70s. And there's people on both sides of that. I think it helped, but I was also visiting homes of parents that had a lot of the same issues that they had passed on to their kids because they had had terrible experiences in schools. What I would say about building relationships is we build relationships by interacting with one another.
Mm.
And I've been a big fan of win win authority relationships. So, what that means is, you're still the boss in the classroom, you're the authority. How do we do that without disempowering kids? Because I taught next door. See, my quote role model was this woman that would go around, and if a kid's leg was out in the aisle, she would kick the kid. Well, I didn't want to do that, and it wasn't just about being mean. It was like I want to treat them the way I want them to treat me. So no kicking, okay, and no yelling. And I didn't want to spend the whole year just criticizing and being boss and disempowering kids because then, all you do is get a lot of pushback. So the relationship and the sense of community happens in an environment where kids can be, look at, go back to Maslow. Remember Maslow? I mean, come on, you guys. I know you've heard of Maslow, okay? And think about what kids need. They want a sense of safety, which means that nobody's going to make fun of them. They need to know how to make a mistake and understand that that's just part of the process of learning. If they already knew everything, what would they need me for? They need belonging. They need a sense of belonging. And for some of my kids, my classroom was the safest place they had, physically and emotionally. They need success. And that includes kids. I had kids who couldn't spell their last name. I had kids when I taught in middle school who couldn't add. So, do I go to the curriculum guides and do the lesson on square roots that I'm supposed to be teaching? Or do we sit down and guess what? You're going to learn how to add today because then they walk out of there smarter than they were when they came in. And that was the year, it was actually my second year of teaching, where I got notes from parents saying, "This is the first time I've seen a math book in my home
Wow.
in 4 years." Because my kids now know that there's a chance they may never get to square roots. I don't care. I couldn't do square roots now if you paid me. It doesn't matter, but they all knew how to do the basic skills, which meant they did much better on the
Mhm.
capital T tests. They did much better behaviorally, and as long as they were behaving okay, I could get away with a lot. So they want success, they want belonging, they want a certain amount of power, and that was a piece that I'm not seeing even now in the literature, in the training, in classroom management classes. There's very little about how to give kids power within limits that don't disempower you, the
Mhm.
authority. And
That's
so that's where the win-win concept came from, is how do you get to be a boss with and meet their needs for power? And in some cases, that's as simple as just giving them a couple choices. Well, which one do you want to do first?
mhm.
And by the way, I had kids who were absolutely overwhelmed by that simple choice. I
Mhm.
had a girl on the verge of tears because she couldn't pick math or spelling first. And in that case, it's like, well, would you like me to decide for you? Because that's a choice too.
Mhm.
And she says, well, yeah. And I said, okay, fine. Why don't you do the math paper first? What'd she say? I want to do the spelling. Now, I have a choice here because my normal reaction is like, why didn't you say something about it? Give you 20 minutes to make up your mind. Or I could do, and this is one of the best techniques I've ever found, not just with kids, but with adults in my life, just agree with them. What a great choice. What was I thinking? There's that. What is she going to say? You can't make me? I
Right.
mean, that just doesn't make sense.
Right.
So yeah, so how do we meet power needs, safety needs, all the needs in Maslow's hierarchy? And it's so simple in some cases, and that's where your sense of community comes from.
Mhm. Now, you talked a lot about kind of um, this win-win idea and the successes that you've had. What was the biggest challenge for you in your classroom in terms of classroom management? Or can you think of a specific incident or a recurring thing that was really tough for you?
Everything, getting them on task, getting them in class on time. I had eighth graders. I had 16-year-old eighth graders that I was supposed to have them after lunch, and they were always coming in late. And no amount of detention, they didn't care about detention. They either wouldn't show up or they were happy to have an hour away from their family. I mean, there was no punishment that was working. And I had this really weird, sometimes these serendipitous things happen. I happened to be reading on my own. I just happened to be reading a book called Watership Down. Just this, it doesn't matter which book you're reading, it just happened to be one I was reading, and it had a picture of a rabbit on the cover. It's a story about a rabbit community. And I was reading it during lunch, and I had the book on the desk, and my kids came in, and I had individualized my math program. So my kids could come in and work very independently and get started and go to their groups or work and help each other. And of course, I noticed there's 3 or 4 kids that are still missing. And it's like, okay, do I look for a bigger hammer to hit them with? I mean, nothing is working. And at that moment, one of the boys walked in and picked up the book and said, are you reading a bunny book? And I just kind of hooked. Was like, yeah, this is a really cool story. Tell you what, on a good day, I had these kids for 40 minutes. On a good day, I was getting 20 minutes of instruction in. I said, tell you what, I'm going to give up the first 5 minutes of class. I'm going to read this story. I really want to share this story with you. I'm just really enjoying it. You want to hear the story? Come to class. Now, I also had to explain that I'm what they call low auditory, which means I'm very easily distracted by noise. And I'm also not a very good sight reader. So if you want to hear the story, it has to be pin drop quiet. All of a sudden now, I've got kids coming to class on time. And I've told people, I swear, if they had gas, they held it because they wanted to hear what happened to them bunnies. And you know what the best part of the story was? This is math class, okay? The best part of the story was at one point I looked up and close to half the class had gotten a copy of the book to read along with me.
Wow, that's awesome.
So this is 40 some years later, and I still get chills and near tears telling this story because it's like, that's why I became a teacher.
Yeah, it's a
Not
great
only that,
story.
but I now have, 35 minutes of instructional time.
Right, right.
I've got 'em. And there was no
Absolutely.
punishment, there was no write-ups. So what was a challenge for me? Everything.
Mm.
Everything. Getting them to shut up, getting them to be prepared, getting them to share with one another. Getting them I had a kid in the middle of the test jump over a table and start pounding on a kid because she looked at me. I mean, you name it. I don't think we ever had like a major fire in class, but that was about it. Pretty much everything. I mean, I've just I had finally gotten when I was being observed and went through about a half dozen failures of trying to get them in their seats and get them busy. When I finally got them engaged, one of the blinds fell off the windows. And when the bell rang, they all got up and dismissed themselves, shaking their heads like, what a loser. So, I mean, yeah, I've been there and I know how hard it is. And I thought the bigger hammers aren't working. First of all, the kids I was working with were getting hammered really well at home.
Hmm.
And they were getting hammered pretty well on the class. They didn't care.
Hmm.
They didn't care. So I had to come in through a side door.
Hmm.
And it took me a while to figure out where that was and what it looked like.
So, what do you think is the biggest pitfall or maybe the biggest misconception that new teachers might have about classroom management? Maybe something that
Well,
we tell them that isn't always true.
well, there's a lot of stuff that I was told. They told me, oh gosh, they told me don't smile before Thanksgiving. That was one of the rules. Don't smile before Thanksgiving, and that's really not a great enhancer of relationships. And I said, I still get teachers now, brand new teachers that are being told that, like, you go in and be very stern. Well, ick, that's not my personality, and that's not what who's going to get excited to, oh great, I get to wake up and listen to, watch a teacher scowl all day. Yuck. They told me, be consistent, which I still don't know what that means. At the time, I thought maybe you were supposed to wear the same thing every day. I didn't realize that that was really about follow through and
Mm.
about really kind of doing what you say you're going to do and saying what you're going to do, what you mean. The other thing, they just, there's so many things they told me, put the rules on the wall. Well, one of the things they said was very popular at the time, let the kids make their own rules. And I swear, this is my right hand to God, we ended up with over 500 things you shouldn't throw. And guess what they were doing while I'm writing this frantically on the board? They're throwing crap all over the room. So it's like, okay, I'm bagging that. So we get a lot of the stuff that we were told in the 60s and 70s is still being promoted very heavily at this time in our history, and it didn't work then, it's not going to work now.
Mhm.
Putting the rules on the wall. I had lunch with the superintendent one day, and I said, "Why do you insist that kids, teachers put the rules on the wall?" I've never had a kid about to be bad and go, "I'm going to throw the, oh, damn, there's a rule. I was going to be bad, but, there's a rule that nobody's ever going to be good because of that." And the superintendent said, "Well, it's got nothing to do with the rules. It's about our liability."
Mm.
So, can we at least tell teachers the truth that the real behavior management is in the connections you make with the kids, their ability to be successful? Because if I come in your classroom and I'm going to fail right off the bat, where's my incentive to behave?
Mhm.
I'm going to get an F either. What are you going to give me, an F minus? You know, so
Yeah.
uh, so it's really about connections. So there's a lot of the other misconception. Call the parents. Have the parents discipline the kids. My parents, the parents of my kids, didn't want to hear from me when there was. In fact, the first time I called a parent was something good because their kid had had a really good day and had this major breakthrough. I called the parent and I said, Billy had a really good day in math. I think he's finally getting his head around this. And she said, "What do you want?" All she heard was Bluestein from the school, and she immediately went into defense. So one of the things I started doing was sending a good note home every Friday. And when I had 160, 70 kids, I picked my toughest classes and I sent them home. And let me tell you something, those notes went home because at the bottom of the note, there were 4 or 5 things that, you know, I always tried to pick out things that the kids could do that I knew the majority of the kids could do. It might be something stupid like say please and thank you. Everybody's going to get at least 3 or 4 checks. Those notes went home. On the bottom of every note, the best 5 minutes, 10 minutes I spent every week was writing a note to a parent. Because imagine you are a parent of an at risk kid who never hears from the school unless there's a problem. And now you get a note that says something like, real helpful in class, came prepared every day, big, big breakthrough in math, or my favorite, I love teaching your child. You are a parent, you get a note like that, you've got an ally.
Mm-hmm.
So expecting parents or the principal to do your discipline work for you makes you look like you have no skill at all, not only to them, but to the kids.
That's awesome. So I'm going to cut us off because we're about 15 minutes now, but we are looking forward to talking to you more, and I'm sure my students will have lots of questions for you. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in class.
I will look forward to it. Thank you.